thank you all for coming out so early this morning. This conference is a homecoming of sorts for me. I have family literally just around the corner in Driftwood Courts, Shoreham, Chimney Stack, and so I feel very much at home. My paper is entitled Saving Jimmy Wilson, Canadian Racial Consciousness and Alabama Justice, 1958. On a sunny August morning in 1958, many Southern Ontarians gathered within earshot of well-positioned radios to hear news unfolding within Canada and around the world. What captivated Canadian minds most on that fateful morning on August 28 had nothing to do with the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict in the Middle East or decolonization of sub-Saharan Africa, or even a showdown between the superpowers for that matter. The place and the actors involved seemed less distant and more familiar than the friction in foreign affairs unfolding around the globe. The news of an African-American man's imminent death by electrocution in less than 8 days in Alabama for petty larceny came as a flagrant shock to the radio listeners' notions of democracy and the rule of law. This news, within 5 days of airing, inspired private citizens, homemakers, children and students, business owners, trade unionists, newly arrived citizens, and immigrants to submit over 3,000 letters of petition that played a pivotal role in the case. Like the thousands of white Canadian women who submitted letters of petition demanding clemency, one petitioner justified her outrage through words that are part and parcel of the Canadian imagination of the United States. Quote, "I am a Canadian and a proud one, and I am proud and know to say this action will never happen in Canada. And I know if I were living where this Negro man lives, the same state, and I being a white woman, I would be ashamed. When I heard the story over my radio, I just couldn't believe it was true. I feel sorry for this man and his people. Maybe I should feel sorry for the white people who are wishing him to receive the death sentence," end quote. One Canadian boy concluded in his limited knowledge of the ways of the world that the egregious punishment of death for paltry theft in a country like the United States resulted from unbridled racial discrimination. Although I am only 16 years old, I know that the jury for Wilson should not have been all white. I don't suppose that if a white person did something wrong, they would have an all-colored jury. The Civil War is over long ago, and it's time the lazy old South woke up to that fact, end quote. In this young Canadian's mind, the South failed to honor the 13th, 14th, and 15th constitutional amendments in subjecting African Americans to racial caste and second-class citizenship in the post-BLM era, which meant Southern whites held on to an archaic past pockmarked with racial intolerance and violence. When Canadians heard of Jimmy Wilson's impending execution, they condemned U.S. race relations yet again. In this presentation, I argue that white Canadians, through their letters of petition, used this gross miscarriage of justice as an opportunity to showcase Canadian liberalism, and more important, the divide in the United States between rhetoric and idealism on the one hand and blatant racial injustice on the other. As citizens with a global consciousness, Canadians repeatedly framed their activism in a Cold War geopolitical discourse that challenged Washington's credibility to lead the free world, considering that some parts of the United States practice laws that parallel the communist bloc. Moreover, the moralism with which the petitioners sanctioned the United States is deeply rooted in the Anglo-Atlantic abolitionist culture that Canadians inherited from the British, the antecedents of which differed sharply from the origins of US society and democracy. The events that led to the planned execution of Jimmy Wilson and the media coverage that outraged Canadians and the international community began on a warm, unremarkable evening in a sleepy town in Marion, Alabama, on July 27, 1957. Jimmy Wilson, a 54-year-old African-American handyman and occasional transient, worked odd jobs for his sustenance in sparsely populated Marion. Unequal distribution of economic opportunities in the post-war years yoked poorly educated and semi-skilled blacks to their white counterparts in exploitative and dependent relationships. Estelle Barker, an elderly white widow, was one who saw cheap labor from African Americans like Wilson. In the months leading up to the alleged robbery and assault, the 82-year-old Barker hired Wilson occasionally to complete odd chores around her house and yard. On the Saturday evening of July 27, Wilson, according to the trial transcript of Barker's testimony, showed up unannounced at her home to work, which Barker refused on account of how late the hour was. This classic case involving an African-American robber and alleged rapist captivated the attention of the international community and fueled the critique of US race relations. From London to Montevideo, from Denmark to Switzerland, from Ghana to Jamaica, Europeans and persons of African descent peppered U.S. consulates with petitions and published editorials in newspapers deriding the self-appointed leader of the free world for its shameful treatment of its black citizens. Not only did the Wilson case stoke the flames of the freedom struggle against colonialism and white supremacy in the global South, but it also forced many whites in the Western world to scrutinize closely U.S. claims of offering the best form of governance, i.e. liberal democracy, in a bipolar world undergoing rapid Soviet and communist expansion. The Toronto Daily Star, now the Toronto Star, broke the news in the Canadian print media 1 week before radio station CKEY declared to the masses on August 28, 1958, that the state of Alabama would execute Jimmy Wilson for robbing an elderly white woman. On August 20th, Martin Goodman, an affable, up-and-coming 23-year-old Jewish Canadian reporter, published an exclusive interview with Wilson while the accused waited on death row at a state penitentiary. Goodman's family had moved from Western Canada to Montreal in his childhood due to the intolerable level of anti-Semitism. These experiences in his formative years shaped Goodman's perception of racism and injustice. For this Canadian, discrimination against Jews or blacks symbolized a tyranny of sorts, one that enabled him to see a struggle against discrimination as linked to those of African descent. At Atmore State Penitentiary, roughly 145 miles south of Montgomery, Goodman sat down with Jimmy Wilson inside the warden's office to conduct what appears to be the only exclusive interview with Wilson while he languished in solitary confinement. That a state prison and not a lynch mob planned Wilson's execution indicated, if for nothing else than symbolic gestures, changes in the South's archaic culture of vigilante justice. In fact, so pervasive was the image of bloodthirsty white mobs in the Southern consciousness that a local paper commented that a state institution in a distant town deliberately imprisoned Wilson, quote, for safekeeping, end quote. The facade of the legal proceedings, the all-white jury, and the presiding justice, which concluded with capital punishment for Wilson, symbolized more than a perfunctory Southern act. It demonstrated that although resolute, the architects of Jim Crow too thought long and hard about the significance of public sentiment. Most US and global citizens, of course, rejected the bait. As Goodman probed further in their interview, Wilson broke his silence and strung together a response that challenged his conviction and death sentence. Quote, "They never asked me anything. The policeman that arrested me, he didn't ask. He say, that's how it happened, wasn't it? I say, no. He cuffed me until I say, yeah, that's how," end quote. A diminutive man, Wilson stood at 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 135 pounds, according to the athletically built Goodman, who stood 4 inches taller. The image that Goodman painted of Wilson is not one of a menacing rapist whose sheer stature alone would suggest a man of whom society should fear. If anything, the image that Goodman put forth is one of the harmless Negro, a Thomish figure whose fear of white supremacy rendered him incapable of harming whites or mounting any direct opposition to the social structures that oppressed him. That Wilson had been unaccompanied with a white woman at a private dwelling in and of itself made him guilty in the court of Jim Crow public opinion. For this reason, one petitioner from Toronto noted, quote, "It soon became apparent to me that this man was being executed not for robbery, but for the alleged, mind you, the alleged assault of a white woman," end quote. A Toronto couple pleaded, quote, "It would be a crime to the human race to execute a man on such flimsy grounds, as prejudice is very obvious. The people in the USA are terrible, narrow-minded about the Negroes," end quote. As historian Barrington Walker shows in his analysis of African Canadians in Ontario's criminal courts in the mid-19th to mid-20th century, although law enforcement and the judicial apparatus feared black male sexuality, elites within these establishments concomitantly evoked the language of British fair play and strongly admonished against lynch law and vigilante justice. Capital punishment in Canada, I should note, remained on the legal books until 1954 for defendants accused of rape, mainly out of an unfounded fear of black men. As a quick sidebar, John A. Macdonald, in defending the young Dominion's need of a death penalty, declared, and I quote, "Negroes, of whom we have too many in Upper Canada, are very prone to felonious assaults on white women. If the sentence and imprisonment were not very severe, there would be great dread of people taking the law into their own hand," end quote. You guys can infer what our founding father was trying to say. Race plays a principal role in shaping Canadian perception of the United States. that the British Crown historically claimed to champion black liberty in North America, beginning first with the arrival of black loyalists in Nova Scotia after the U.S. Revolutionary War, the nominal abolition of slavery in Upper Canada in 1793, the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, the second arrival of black loyalists in Canada after the War of 1812, the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire in 1833, and the emergence of Canada as a refuge point for enslaved fugitives has created a lore about Canada's inheritance of a British brand of progressivism and racial tolerance. For Canadians, the enduring legacies of these historical processes continue to shape notions of race, notions of justice, and notions of freedom. This phenomenon is what I call Anglo-Canadian exceptionalism. That is, the ability to see racism only as a problem in foreign countries, especially the United States. As such, white Canadians, especially those of British extraction, use race relations in the United States as a litmus test of sorts to deny claims of racism in Canadian society. When radio station CKEY forwarded the petitions to Governor Folsom's office in Montgomery, Alabama, very few Canadians could have predicted the immediate impact that their activism would have on Jimmy Wilson's imminent execution. With pressure mounting on U.S. diplomats around the world, the state of Alabama had to pay closer attention to the currents of international affairs. Although the Alabama Supreme Court denied Wilson's appeal following a routine motion in August 1958, the state delayed his execution date to October 24th. On September 13th, nearly 2 weeks after pleading to Canadians to lend their support and good names to Jimmy Wilson, CKEY orchestrated the delivery of 3,000 letters of petition to Governor Folsom. At a press conference later that day, Folsom quipped that he, quote, was snowed under with mail from Toronto demanding clemency, end quote. Folsom also admitted in his 2 terms as governor that he had, quote, never seen anything like it, end quote. On September 30th, 1958, Governor Folsom granted Jimmy Wilson clemency. In accepting the challenge to denounce Southern racial oppression openly, Canadians proved yet again their belief in and commitment to a legacy of justice and freedom. As one Toronto couple proclaimed, quote, we vote life, not death, for a Negro who no doubt suffers only from his environment under questionable democracy, end quote. The egregiousness and sheer audacity of Wilson's punishment obligated Canadians to live up to the moral rhetoric of British justice and fair play, which, in both theory and praxis, enabled white Canadians to showcase their primacy vis-a-vis whites in the United States. In this script, Canadians could freely tout their liberal and progressive attitudes, deny the structures of white supremacy that undergirded Canadian society, and confined African Canadians to second-class citizenship, while repudiating Jim Crow and the vacuous U.S. rhetoric of democracy and the rule of law during the Cold War. Thank you.